We begin with a major development in the war in Gaza. Hamas says it has agreed to a mediated ceasefire proposal from Egypt and Qatar. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that the proposed framework falls well short of Israel's demands. Word of the potential temporary ceasefire sparked jubilation in the streets of Rafah. More than 1 million Palestinians are now sheltering in the city. Just hours earlier, Israel had urged 100,000 people in the eastern part of Rafah to evacuate because of a looming ground offensive. And Richard Madden joins me now live from Washington with more on this. Richard, what do we know or actually know about this agreement that Hamas says it has accepted, but that Israel has not?
Yeah, hey, Sarah. Well, you're right. Full details of this framework haven't been shared publicly, but we're starting to see some new reporting tonight on some of the terms that are on the table. Now, this is reporting by various outlets in the region and in the U.S. sourcing Egyptian officials, and we're looking to confirm it. Now, this proposal includes 3 phases. The first is the release of some, not all, Israeli hostages in exchange for a 6-week pause in fighting, and that would be followed by another 6-week pause, and eventually for the U.S. to guarantee an end to the war. Now, both American and Israeli officials have said this framework proposed by Egypt and Qatar is different from an earlier one brokered by the U.S. and Israel. And one of Israel's top cabinet ministers says there are, quote, significant gaps between Israel and Hamas, but the Israelis are sending negotiating teams to Cairo tomorrow to keep talks going, so they haven't closed the door yet. And while Hamas may have agreed to certain terms, Israel says they're still far apart and are willing to keep talking. So the tense situation continues with this proposed deal accepted by Hamas.
So, Richard, you mentioned the United States. The United States is Israel's most important ally. What are we hearing from the U.S. president about this, or the administration?
Yeah, in a word, caution. We heard earlier today from National Security spokesperson John Kirby at the White House. He confirmed President Biden was briefed and the administration is reviewing it. But it was notable, Sarah, how he chose his words very carefully, reacting to this proposal agreed to by Hamas. He said talks are at such a critical stage right now, and he doesn't want to say anything from the White House podium to jeopardize it from crossing the finish line. Take a listen.
Just not going to get ahead of the process. We want to get these hostages out. We want to get a ceasefire in place for 6 weeks. We want to increase humanitarian assistance. And the last thing that I want to do is say anything at this podium that's going to put that process at risk.
Now, Kirby confirmed that CIA Director Bill Burns was involved in the negotiations and remains on the ground as talks continue. Now, he also stressed that President Biden's 30-minute call this morning with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu happened before news broke on the ceasefire proposal. So beyond this message of caution from the White House, we're also picking up a sense of skepticism because many analysts point out we're mostly hearing from one side, Hamas. So this could all be spin coming from them designed to portray the Israelis of not acting in good faith to pause fighting and release the hostages. Now, here's how Kirby responded to that question.
You know who hasn't answered a single question about his intentions and what games he might be playing or where he intends to take this? Mr. Sinwar, the head of Hamas. And I think it's high time that he answers some of these questions and he come clean about what his intentions are. I don't know. All I know is we've got a response. Bill Burns is looking at that response. He's talking to the Israelis about it, and we'll see where this goes.
Now, Kirby also said President Biden told Prime Minister Netanyahu that he doesn't want to see greater ground operations in Rafah and humanitarian aid must continue unobstructed. But as we know, Israel has since proceeded its military operation. They're attacking targets, so this could complicate any agreement.
Absolutely. Thanks, Richard. That's Richard Madden in Washington. Okay, with us now is Frank Lowenstein. He is the former U.S. Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, and he joins us now from Washington. Frank, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
So, in your understanding, you're obviously watching this closely, as really we all are. How close do you think that Hamas and Israel actually are to striking a deal?
I'm afraid they're still quite far apart. The core issue in these negotiations has been whether the ceasefire would be temporary, which is what the Israelis want, or permanent, which is what Hamas wants. And that's really been the core negotiating point for the last several months. And I don't think anything's changed in that regard. If you saw Haniyeh, the head of Hamas, when he accepted ostensibly the proposal, he said there were guarantees. He was given guarantees that this would be a permanent end to the war. There's no such thing as a guarantee this is an end of the war. The Israelis have said just the opposite. So I have a feeling that this was more posturing on the side of Hamas to try to put Bibi in the position of being the one to reject the ceasefire rather than any serious effort on their part to reach an agreement. And honestly, from the Israeli perspective, I don't think Netanyahu wants an agreement either. I think both sides are responding to the pressure that we've been putting on them and the Qataris and others have been putting on Hamas. But it hasn't changed the underlying issue here, which is that both sides want to continue the war. And there's very little we can do to stop that if that's where they're at.
Yeah, so that leads me to my next question here, because both Israel and Hamas officials have been accused of accepting untenable deals in order to kind of lob the ball back into the other's court, if you will. Do you think, I mean, you sort of have alluded to this, but do you think that either side is actually committed to a ceasefire?
I don't.
Or agreeing to one?
I think that the politics on both sides, as the leaders there understand it, would lead to them continuing the conflict. Netanyahu obviously has a very extreme right-wing coalition, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, and they want to go in and attack Rafah and kill basically everybody they possibly can there. And that's Netanyahu's core constituency. That's his base there. So whatever else happens, at the end of the day, if he has to choose between the United States and his coalition, he's going to choose his coalition. So my sense is that the Israelis not only are not overly optimistic about this ceasefire proposal, they haven't stopped their Rafah effort at all. We just saw a news release from the IDF to the effect that they're going to take over the Philadelphia corridor right now, which is the strip of land in between Rafah and the Egyptian border. So look with these parties at what they're doing and not what they're saying. What the Israelis are doing is proceeding with the Rafah incursion. And so I think that's probably going to be what's actually going on here, even though they'll send negotiators back to Cairo or Qatar or wherever they're taking place. It's low-level folks that are going there. The Hamas guys left yesterday. I don't know if they're going back now. But in any event, none of those people are empowered to make a deal. So none of this really suggests to me that either side is serious about reaching a ceasefire.
You touched on what I want to ask here, which is Hamas, you don't know if they're going to actually be at the table or not. Israel is sending someone. You're saying that that's low level. If they're not both at the table, then what exactly is happening at the table in terms of the negotiations?
Yeah, in all honesty, I think it's performative. And we were in this situation, Secretary Kerry and I were in 2014 trying to negotiate a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. And we kept going to one side and asking, for them to make certain concessions, and then the other side. And at the end of the day, the goalposts just kept moving. And ultimately, we did get them to agree, but they were very reluctant about it. And the ceasefire fell apart almost immediately. And that's my concern here now is if neither side really wants this, they're really just posturing to blame the other. And we somehow or other drive them to the table, against their will. The ceasefire won't last anyway. So I think there was a lot of optimism when people saw the headline from Hania that Hamas had accepted the offer. They didn't accept the offer that was on the table, and the core issue has yet to be resolved. So I think it's really looking like we're going to be, heading towards a Rafah invasion in the days ahead.
Which is, heartbreaking because we saw the celebrations in Rafah, the idea that might not happen. But we haven't seen a ceasefire since November. I'm not going to say that was an easy ceasefire to reach, but we got there, or they got there. Why is it so much harder now to hit some kind of a deal than it was back then?
Well, I think the politics have changed on both sides. First of all, for the Israelis, Prime Minister Netanyahu is really under a lot of pressure to proceed with this Rafah invasion from the people that he cares most about. And for their part, Hamas, I think they think they're winning this war, which is a horrifying concept. But, their notion is that Bibi's stepping into a trap in Rafah, that he's going to get sideways with the United States. He's going to invite further international condemnation, and they're going to be in a very, very tough battle in an urban context and inside of the tunnels where Hamas maybe has the advantage. So I think the Hamas guys are willing to sacrifice thousands and thousands of Palestinian civilians if they think it advances their cause. And it seems to me like they're comfortable now with a lot of people getting killed so that they can take what they view as the moral high ground, or at least have Israel as isolated as they possibly can. So it's a really tough situation all around right now.
Is Netanyahu walking into a trap? Is he going to do something that is going to be ultimately bad for him that he just doesn't see?
Well, I think he's definitely going to get into some big public arguments with President Biden. Biden's politics are very strongly in favor of a ceasefire here. Obviously, you've all seen the campus protests, and I think he would like to take some of the energy out of that movement now with a ceasefire, right? So that's why we've been pushing the parties so hard to reach an agreement. But again, they don't care about our politics over there. Bibi would like to see President Trump win. So he's hardly going to shed a tear over Biden's political problems. And from Hamas's perspective, the more protests there are in America, the stronger of a position they're in right now. So yeah, in the prior agreement, there was Hamas, I think, wanted to get rid of a whole bunch of civilian hostages that they didn't really know what to do with. In this case, I think the politics have shifted now, and the situation on the ground has shifted where a ceasefire is going to be much harder to achieve now than it was before.
Frank Lowenstein, former U.S. Special Envoy for Middle East Peace. Frank, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.